All right, chapter 11. We had been walking in silence through the night until we stopped to listen to the singing of morning birds shattering the silence of the day. As we sat on the side of the path, Mariba began to sob. He was sitting away from us, something he usually did with Saidu. He played with a piece of branch, trying to distract himself from what he was feeling. Everyone except me started to sob and moved next to Mariba, who was now crying loudly. I sat by myself, covering my face with the palms of my hands to hold back my tears. After a few minutes, my friend stopped crying. We continued on without saying a word to each other. We all knew that we could grieve only for a short while in order to continue staying alive. I look forward getting to this village. I will give my mother a very tight hug. Al Haji smiled and then continued. She always complains, though, when I give her a tight hug. If you love me, stop squeezing my old bones so I can be alive longer. She is funny. We giggled. I have a feeling that we will find our families, or at least news of them. Kane stretched his hands as if trying to catch the sun. He looked at Al Haji, who was smiling uncontrollably. I heard you have a beautiful sister. I am still just your friend, right? We all started laughing. Al Haji jumped on Kane's back, and they began to wrestle in the grass. When they were done, they followed us on the path, singing one of S.E. Roji's songs, Nor Look Me Bad Eye, Nor Weigh Me Like That. We joined in and sang as if we were having one of life's most glorious moments. But slowly silence returned and took over. One side of the sky was completely blue, and the other was filled with stagnant clouds. The quiet breeze caused a branch to snap in the forest. The echo sounded like a cry, a wailing. I wasn't the only one who noticed it, because my friend stopped briefly and listened attentively. The breeze picked up its pace. The leaves of the trees began to rub against each other, resisting the wind. More branches snapped in the forest, and the wailing intensified. The trees looked as if they were in pain. They swayed in all directions and slapped each other with their branches. The clouds rolled over the blue sky, and it became dark. A heavy rain followed, with thunder and lightning that lasted for less than 15 minutes. Afterward, the sky returned to its bluest. I walked perplexed in my soaked clothes under the sun. At nighttime, it began to rain again. The strands of rain fell brutally from the sky, whipping us. We walked for most of the night, wiping the water off our faces in order to see. It became unbearable to continue, so we sat at the foot of huge trees and waited. Whenever the lightning lit the forest, I could see where everyone was sitting. We all had our faces resting on our knees and our arms were crossed. The last hours of the night were long. By the time the rain stopped, it was late. We were all shivering, our fingertips pale and wrinkled. We look like soaked chickens, Musa said, laughing as we emerged from under the trees. We found an opening where the sun had begun penetrating, and we squeezed and spread our shirts on the tops of the bushes and sat in the sun to dry ourselves. It was almost midday when we put on our damp clothes and continued walking. A few hours later, we heard a cock crow in the distance. Musa jumped in the air and we all began to laugh. Finally, we were approaching the village where seeing our families was actually a possibility. I couldn't stop smiling. Coffee trees began to replace the forest, and footprints appeared on the path. We heard rice being pounded in whispers in the breeze. We quickened our pace as those sounds assured us that life was ahead. On the opposite side of the coffee farm was a small banana farm, and there we came across a man cutting down hands of ripe bananas. We couldn't see his face, as his head was behind the leaves. Good afternoon, Kane said. The man peeped at us from behind a banana leaf. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and walked towards us. As he approached, slowly making his way through the noisy dried banana leaves, the sight of his face awakened my memory. His face was a little wrinkled now, and he was much skinnier than when I had last seen him. His name was Gasemu, Nyor, which means a respectful term for the first name you call adults. Gasemu. He used to be one of the notorious single men in my town. Back then, everyone talked about him not being married. The older people always remarked, he is old enough and responsible enough to find himself a good wife, but he likes to be alone. He likes that loose life. He never said anything back then and didn't get upset by what they said. He cooked his own food, and when he was too tired to cook, he ate gari for over a week. My mother decided to dish him out a plate every evening. "That food is unhealthy for you," she said to him, and he smiled, rubbing his head. When Gasemu was by the path, he stopped and examined our faces. He smiled, and that was when I became sure that he was Nyor Gasemu I knew, because he was missing a front tooth. "You boys want to help me carry some bananas to the village?" he asked in that manner that adults usually ask young people, so that we knew he wouldn't take no for an answer. "Come on, boys." He motioned for us to follow him into the banana farm. All of us started walking past him as he continued waving his hand as if he was pulling us with an invisible rope. When I approached him, he put his hand on my shoulder and rubbed my head. "Are you still a troublesome boy?" He pulled on my nose. "There is no time to be troublesome these days," I said. "I see that you look very sad. Your forehead used to glow naturally when you were just a child. Your parents and I used to discuss how unusual that was. We thought it was because you were happy all the time. Your mother said you even smiled while you slept. But when you started your troublesomeness and you were angry, your forehead glowed even more. We didn't have any other explanations for your forehead and how it related to your character. And here you are, it isn't shining anymore." He paused for a moment, looking at me. He walked away and began instructing my traveling companions how to pick up a hand of bananas and carry it on their shoulders instead of their heads. "This way you won't break them in half," he explained. I picked up some of the bananas and waited for Gasemu to gather his water jug, machete, and the last bunch. "So, how did you get—" I started, but he interrupted. "Your parents and brothers will be happy to see you. They've been talking about you every day and praying for your safety. Your mother cries every day, begging the gods and ancestors to return you to her. Your older brother left to look for you, but he returned about a week ago. His face was sad when he returned. I think he blames himself for losing you." I dropped the hand as he started giving me this news. He continued walking, so I quickly picked up the bananas and followed him. "They will indeed be surprised to see you." He walked slowly in front of me. I was breathing fast and couldn't bring out a word. I wanted to drop the hand and run as fast as I could to the village. My eyelids were twitching, and I felt as if the breeze was passing through my brain. It made me feel lightheaded. Excitement and sadness made me feel as if my heart would explode if I waited any longer. But on such a narrow path, I couldn't walk past all those in front of me. After a few minutes, we came to a river, and I was happy because at the edge of most villages, there was a river. So I thought we should be there any minute now, but we weren't yet. "The village is just over the hill," Gasemu said. It was a long hill with rocks on either side of the path and some immovable ones the road makers had left in the middle. The path zigzagged up to the top, where when we finally made it, everyone had to rest for a few minutes. I became angry that we had to rest, and I sat on a big rock away from the group. My eyes followed the brown, dusty path that continued down the hill to the thick forest, through which I caught a glimpse of the thatched and tin roofs of the village. Part of me was on the way to the village, and the other impatiently waited on the hill. Gasimu passed around his jug of water, which I refused. When it got back to him, we picked up the banana hands and started down the hill. I started before everyone else so that I could walk fast and be in front. As I was going down the hill, I heard gunshots and dogs barking and people screaming and crying. We dropped the bananas and began running in order to avoid the open hillside. A thick smoke started rising from the village. At the tops of it, sparks of flames leapt into the air. We hid in the nearby bushes and listened to gunshots and the screams of men, women, and children. The children wailed. Men screamed at high pitches that pierced through the forest and covered the shrieks of women. The gunshots finally ceased, and the world was very quiet, as if listening. I told Gasimu that I wanted to go to the village. He held me back, but I shoved him into the bushes and ran down the path as fast as I could. I didn't feel my legs. When I got to the village, it was completely on fire, and bullet shells covered the ground like mango leaves in the morning. I did not know where to begin looking for my family. Gasimu and my friends had followed me, and we all stood looking at the flaming village. I was sweating because of the heat, but I wasn't afraid to run in between the houses. Nails were popping off tin roofs, and they flew by, landing on nearby thatched roofs, increasing the wrath of the fire. As we were watching a flaming tin roof in flight, we heard screams and loud banging a few houses away. We ran behind the houses at the edge of the coffee trees and came upon the house where the cries were coming from. The people were locked in it. The fire was already too much inside. It showed its face through the windows in the roof. We picked up a mortar and banged the door open, but it was too late. Only 2 people came out, a woman and a young child. They were on fire and ran up and down the village, slamming themselves against everything in their way and going back in the other direction to do the same. The woman fell and stopped moving. The child gave a loud screech and sat next to a tree. He stopped moving. It all happened so fast that we just stood there, rooted to the ground. The child's yelp was still echoing in my head, as if it had taken on a life of its own inside me. Gasimu had wandered away from where I stood. He began screaming from another side of the village. We ran to where he was. More than 20 people lay face down in the earth. They were all lined up, and blood still poured out of their bullet wounds. A stream of it had begun running along the ground, making its way under each body, as if joining them together. Gasemu's sobs grew louder as he turned each body over. Some of their mouths and eyes were open in shapes that showed how much they had cringed as they waited for the bullets from behind. Some had inhaled dirt, perhaps while taking their last breath. Their bodies were mostly men in their late and early 20s. A few were younger. On other paths of the village were the half-burnt remains of those who had fought fiercely to free themselves, only to die outside. They lay on the ground in different postures of pain, some reaching for their heads, the white bones in their jaws visible, others curled up like a child in a womb, frozen. The fire had begun to die down, and I was running around the village looking for something I did not want to see. I hesitantly tried to make out the faces of burnt bodies, but it was impossible to tell who they had been. Besides, there were too many of them. They stayed in that house, Gasumu said to me as he pointed toward one of the charred houses. The fire had consumed all the door and window frames, and the mud that had been pushed in between the sticks was falling off, revealing the ropes through which the remaining fire was making its way. My entire body went into shock. Only my eyes moved, slowly opening and closing. I tried to shake my legs to get my blood flowing, but I fell to the ground, holding my face. On the ground, I felt as if my eyes were growing too big for their sockets. I could feel them expanding, and the pain released my body from the shock. I ran toward the house. Without any fear, I went inside and looked around the smoke-filled rooms. The floors were filled with heaps of ash. No solid form of a body was inside. I screamed at the top of my lungs and began to cry as loudly as I could, punching and kicking with all my might into the weak walls that continued to burn. I had lost my sense of touch. My hands and feet punched and kicked the burning walls, but I couldn't feel a thing. Ghassemu and the rest of the other boys began pulling me away from the house. I kept kicking and punching as they dragged me out. I have looked around for them, but I can't see them anywhere, Ghassemu said. I was sitting on the ground with my legs spread in the dirt, holding my head in my hands. I was filled up with anger. I hissed and boiled, and my heart felt as if it was going to explode. At the same time, I felt as if something had literally been placed on my head, heavier than I could imagine, and my neck was beginning to ache. If we hadn't stopped to rest on that hill, if we hadn't run into Ghassemu, I would have seen my family, I thought. My head was burning as if on fire. I put my hands on both ears and squeezed them in vain. I didn't know what was happening to me. I got up, walked behind Ghassemu, and locked his neck under my arms. I squeezed him as hard as I could. I can't breathe, he said, fighting back. He pushed me off, and I fell next to a pestle. I picked it up and hit Ghassemu with it. He fell, and when he got up, his nose was bleeding. My friends held me back. Ghassemu looked at me and said sadly, I didn't know this was going to happen. He walked toward a mango tree and sat by it, wiping the blood falling from his nose. My friends had pinned me to the ground and were vehemently arguing. Some said it was Ghassemu's fault that we didn't get to see our parents. Others said it wasn't, that if it hadn't been for him, we would all be dead. I didn't care. I wanted to see my family, even if it meant dying with them. My friends started fighting among themselves, kicking, punching, throwing each other to the ground. Al-Haji pushed Juma into one of the houses, and his pants caught on fire. He screamed as he rolled in the dirt, slapping the fire off. When Juma got up, he picked up a stone and threw it at Al-Haji. It hit Al-Haji on the back of his head. Blood ran down his neck. When Al-Haji saw his blood, he became furious and ran towards Juma, but Ghassemu intervened. He pulled Al-Haji away and tied his bleeding head with a piece of cloth. We were all quiet and angry in the ruins of the village, where it seemed our journey had ended. None of this is anyone's fault, Ghassemu said slowly. His words made me angry, and I wanted to rush him again. But we heard loud voices of people approaching the village. We ran into the nearby coffee farm and lay in the dirt watching the village. A group of more than 10 rebels walked into the village. They were laughing and giving each other high fives. 2 looked slightly older than me. They had blood on their clothes, and one of them carried the head of a man, which he held by the hair. The head looked as if it had been still feeling its hair being pulled. Blood dripped from where the neck had once been. The other rebel carried a gallon of gasoline and a big box of matches. The rebel sat on the ground and started playing cards, smoking marijuana, and boasting about what they had done that day. We burned about 3 villages today. One skinny guy, who was perhaps enjoying himself more than everyone else, laughed. Another rebel, the only one dressed in full army gear, agreed with him. Yes, 3 is impressive in just a few hours in the afternoon. He paused, playing the side of his G3 weapon. I especially enjoyed burning this village. We caught everyone here. No one escaped. That is how good it was. We carried out the command and executed everyone. Commander will be pleased when he gets here. He nodded, looking at the rest of the rebels, who had stopped the game to listen to him. They all agreed with him, nodding their heads. They gave each other high fives and resumed their game. Some people escaped in the other 2 villages, the other rebel, who was standing up, said. He paused, rubbing his forehead, as if pondering why that had happened, and then continued. They probably saw the smoke from this village and knew something was happening. We should change our strategy. Next time, we must attack all the villages at the same time. The others didn't pay him as much attention as they did when the rebel dressed in the army suit spoke. The rebels went on with their card games, chatting for hours, and then, for no apparent reason, they shot a couple of rounds into the air. Someone in my group moved, and the dried coffee leaves made some noise. The rebels stopped playing their game and ran in different directions to take cover. Two started walking towards us, aiming their guns. They walked fast and then crouched. As if planned, we all got up and started running. Bullets followed us out of the coffee farm and into the forest. Gasimu was in front, and he knew where he was going. We all followed him. When we reached the forest's edge, Gasimu stopped and waited for us to catch up. Follow the path straight, he told us. When I reached him, he tried to smile at me. I do not know why, but it made me angrier. I ran past him and followed the narrow path on which grass had grown. I was behind Al-Haji, who parted the bushes like a diver heading to the surface for air. Some of the bushes slapped me, but I didn't stop. The gunshots grew louder behind us. We ran for hours deeper into the forest. The path had ended, but we kept running until the sky swallowed the sun and gave birth to the moon. The bullets continued to fly behind us, but now their redness could be seen as they pierced through the bushes. The moon disappeared and took the stars with it, making the sky weep. Its tears saved us from the red bullets. We spent the night breathing heavily under bushes soaked with rain. The hunters had given up. Gasimu began to cry like a child. It always made me afraid when such things happened. In my younger years, I had learned that grown men cry only when they have no other choice. Gasimu rolled on the ground in pain. When we finally summoned the courage to pick him up, we found out why he was crying. He had been shot some time as we ran away the previous night. His right leg was bleeding and begun to swell. He was holding his side and didn't want to remove his hand. Al-Haji lifted Gasu's hand. His side was bleeding as well. It was as if his hand had been holding his blood from flowing. It rushed out of him like water breaking banks. He began to sweat. Al-Haji asked me to contain the blood by placing my hand on Gasumu's side. I did, but his blood continued to slip through my fingers. He looked at me, his eyes sadly beginning to sink deeper into their sockets. He managed to raise his weak right hand to hold the wrist of my hand that was on his side. He'd stopped sobbing, even though his tears still ran down his eyes, but not as much as the blood that he was losing. Musa couldn't bear the sight of blood any longer. He fainted. Al-Haji and I took Gasumu's shirt off and tied it around the side to contain his blood. The rest of our companions watched with tense faces. Musa woke up and joined them. In between Gasumu's gasps, he told us that there was a wale, a place outside villages where people process coffee or other crops, nearby, and that if we went back towards the farm, he would show us how to rejoin the path and get to it. We had taken the wrong turn during the night. Gasumu put his arm around my shoulder and Al-Haji's. We lifted him up and began walking slowly through the bushes. We set him down every few minutes and wiped his sweaty forehead. It was past midday when Gasumu began heaving, his entire body shaking. He asked us to set him down. He held his stomach and began to roll in pain from one side to the other. His heaving increased, and he stopped rolling. He lay flat on his back, staring at the sky. His eyes were fixed on something, and his legs vibrated and stopped. His hands did the same. And then finally his fingers, but his eyes remained open, transfixed on the top of the forest. Let's pick him up. Al-Haji's voice was shaking. I put Gasumu's arm around my neck. Al-Haji did the same, and we walked with him, his feet dragging on the ground. His arms were cold, his body was still sweating, and he continued bleeding. We didn't say a word to each other. We all knew what happened. When we finally got to the Wali, Gasuma's eyes were still opened. El Haji closed them. I sat by him. His blood was on my palm and my wrist. I regretted hitting him with the pestle. The dry blood was still on his nose. I began to cry softly. I couldn't cry as much as I wanted to. The sun was getting ready to leave the sky. It had come out to take Gasumu with it. I just sat by him, unable to think. My face began to harden. When the breeze blew against it, I felt how my flesh resisted enjoying the cool wind. All through the night, no sleep came to me. My eyes watered and dried over and over again. I did not know what to say. For a few minutes, I tried to imagine what it felt like for Gasumu when his fingers vibrated to let the last air out of his body.